gives me a lot of pleasure to sort of return this work in some ways to where it began. I'm going to talk about the larger project, what we've been interested in that project, looking at the anthropometric history of New Zealand, outline where we get our data to address this question of how does being tall or short or thin or fat affect how long you live, and then talk about our substantive results, compare them to the few other historical studies that have been done about this question, and then to the modern literature, which is a little more extensive and has been in the news recently about whether you actually can do better if you're a little stouter. A lot of acknowledgements, which I'll just mention briefly. We've been funded for the data collection of this by a wide range of organisations. The majority of the funding has come from the Health Research Council and the Marsden Fund, and without the research assistants listed there primarily, we'd still be down at Archives New Zealand typing in the data ourselves, or out at the Defence Force archives out in Trentham. And being here, I should also note the assistance of Peter Crampton, who was here when I first conceived of the project, gave me a great rap session of rapid fire questions about, why should the Health Research Council fund this historical stuff when there's lots of pressing current day issues? And that was very helpful. And also Chris Cunningham from Massey was also very helpful from around these parts. So as Hira mentioned, this is drawn out of a larger project, and this specific paper, we had a lot of hopes for it, but we didn't know whether it would work. Being able to trace people through multiple sets of records in the New Zealand context. So our larger project was taking multiple cross sections and multiple sources of data to look at New Zealand's well-being through the lens of height and weight, which is an approach which has been used a great deal overseas, but until we did this, not in New Zealand. And knowing the broad outlines of when data would be available in New Zealand, we wanted to look at that from the 19th century to the present for people born mid-19th century onwards. There's a lot of information about, or a decent amount of information about Maori mortality, but not a lot of information about the health of living Maori. And so in the New Zealand context, we were very interested in what was the impact of colonial settlement, can we pick out some health effects of colonisation, and how did that change over time? And then the New Zealand standard of living in terms of income has been pretty well documented. My co-author Les Oxley has worked pretty extensively on that. And one of the findings that comes out of the overseas literature, looking at the biological standard of living, height and weight over time, is that the trends don't always match up with what we know about income, particularly in the late 19th century with urban growth, industrial growth, and then income growth. People were actually getting shorter in a lot of parts of Europe. There's debated whether that the same thing was happening in Australia. In the United States, there's the well-known antebellum puzzle where there's rapid personal income growth before the Civil War, but the population is shrinking. So was that the case in New Zealand? The historiography and the promotional literature, people like William Pember Reeves at the turn of the 20th century talk about New Zealand as a very healthy country. So, perhaps New Zealand was different, and I'll show you what we've found about that. All of this presupposes that we can use stature as a measure of living standards, and there's some assumptions embodied in that. This has become a well-used research approach. And of course, height, as most people start from the assumption that it's mostly genetic. But about 20% of the variation in heights comes from social and environmental factors, and that's what we're really interested in documenting. To do that, we're not interested in individual heights of individual people, but in population averages over time. And the intuition of this anthropometric approach is that the body first puts nutrients to immediate needs first, to physical activity, to fighting disease, and only lastly to growing taller. So there's three sort of paths through which changes in nutrition will lead to changes in the average stature of the population, and I've outlined the three different mechanisms there. Holding the other ones constant, people could consume less food, and that could come through a rise in the price of food, particularly a rise in the price of protein-intensive food. Physical exertion is another source, so if you're eating the same amount and during your childhood you're consuming the same amount of food but you're working harder, perhaps on a dairy farm. This has been a concern in New Zealand in the past, that child labour on farms was literally stunting the growth of children. Then that, if it was widespread, would lead to a decline in average stature. And then disease. The body puts nutrients to fighting disease. So if you're frequently ill during childhood, you're more likely to end up shorter than you could have been at the end of your life. And on a population level, if these things are widespread, we'll see a fall in the average stature of the population that grew up living under the same conditions. So to do that, we need pretty large samples, because we're not interested in the individual heights of people. We're interested in people who are born at the same time, and then we are also interested in picking out people who are exposed to similar social and environmental conditions. So perhaps they all lived in Wellington, they were the children of similar occupational groups, so that we can distinguish inequality and differences among the population. So we need large samples, and over the course of this project we've collected about 100,000 individual records out of the military enlistment files and the extant prison records for New Zealand. Picking out the change over time is sometimes challenging, because within a cross-section of people born around the same time, there's often significant social class differences. Particularly in the United Kingdom, from where many New Zealanders came, social class differences were pretty large. So the children of labourers in Britain in the mid-19th century could be 4 to 5 inches shorter than the children of professional workers. That's a large difference in average heights. The average stature of the population is not increasing as rapidly as that. So picking out that sort of small centimetre over 10 years change in average stature when you've got these large class differences is sometimes difficult. And then the nature of the sources that we use also presents some challenges of, is this the same sample out of the population as in previous cohorts? The first nationally representative nutrition and anthropometric samples were done in Canada, this is in the world, in the 1950s. So for any research about this before World War II, one relies very heavily on military and prison sources. Another source, which it can also be used sometimes, is school records, but again, some significant selection effects before the introduction of compulsory education, and you're often not following people for a long period of time. School records also have the disadvantage that you don't see their final height. And growth is fairly plastic. People could be growing shorter in their teens, but then catch up later in their life. So what you really want is sort of final height, and military and prison records provide that. And so we started relying on the military records, and then moved to the prison records to sort of confirm, corroborate some of what we were seeing. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about what we've found over time for New Zealand, and then move to the cohort from World War I that we've followed from birth to death, including their military enlistment records at World War I. And look at what was their survival experience, how long did they live, how did that compare to the overall, the same cohort in the general population, and then look at this question of how did their height and weight affect their mortality, their length of life, and compare that to the modern literature. There's a sort of bigger question lurking in here, which is how does height and weight affect our life expectancy, and that's not just a question particular to New Zealand. We assume in the sort of anthropometric approach that the height and weight potential of populations is pretty similar. So in the end, we're interested in generalising from the New Zealand population perhaps to the wider population in the developed world at the same time. And I think that one can quibble about the differences at points. New Zealand life expectancy and income is similar enough to other English-speaking countries at the same time that perhaps New Zealand's experience was similar, and that these results may be of wider interest than just in New Zealand. So the point of this slide, if you can't distinguish the different colours, that's sort of the point. Is that, with the exception of Canada in the 19th century, most of these major English-speaking countries have around the same level of income. There's a little blip here, proud for New Zealand in World War I, or just before World War I, when New Zealand had the highest average incomes in the world momentarily, and since fallen back. But you can see that really until the 1950s, the income trajectory of all of these countries was pretty similar, and the US starts to pull ahead after World War II, but not major differences. New Zealand has an early advantage in life expectancy. I think this is well known, but again, by the early 20th century, a lot of those differences between the major English-speaking countries have started to erode. For the cohort that we're interested in, which are born in here around the 1890s, enlisted in World War I around here. They're then exposed in the years we're interested in, when they're in their 50s and 60s, to a pretty similar public health environment as in other English-speaking countries. So broadly, I think the results that we're finding are not just going to be particular to New Zealand. We can tentatively generalise them to other places. That early New Zealand advantage in life expectancy comes largely through much lower, significantly lower levels of infant mortality. And here is, over time, the levels of infant mortality in England and Wales, in the United States, and then here's New Zealand. New Zealand obviously has a less urban population, or the urban areas are not as large. We actually, on the common definition of urban areas, have a population that urbanizes in advance of the United States and Australia. Comparing like for like, infant mortality in rural areas in New Zealand was lower than in comparable areas in the United States and in Britain. In the 1890s, New Zealand's infant mortality rate outside the four main centres was 84 per thousand. In Britain at the same time, in similarly dense or not dense areas, their infant mortality rate was 129 per thousand, so 50% higher. So New Zealand's life expectancy advantage comes largely through this infant mortality gap, which is significant and not just because of the different composition of the population. So broadly similar levels of income and a slightly better public health environment for the group that we're looking at compared to other major English-speaking countries. For this paper, what we're drawing on largely is World War I enlistment forms and birth and death certificates. That's our primary data source. In the larger project, just to give you a sense of the context of how we can draw a picture of height and weight from for people born from about 1830 through to the present, or the 1990s, because we're interested in terminal height. Military records, thankfully New Zealand had a lot of conflicts and rushed to participate in conflicts. World War I and World War II are really pretty good in that sense as well, because we had conscription fairly early. I mentioned the selection issues with volunteers, and particularly the South African War. That's a bit of an issue. The South African volunteers are pretty tall. They're also socio-economically selected. A lot of them in the early years of the South African War had to provide their own horse. So that's kind of an unusual requirement to be in the sample. Prisons, insert your own joke here, tend to draw on perhaps the other end of the distribution. One of the, and I try and phrase this politely, one of the good things about the colonial state was that a lot of Maori appeared in prison. So we have a great deal of information about Maori heights from the prisons. I obviously don't think that's a good thing for, perspective of race relations, but for our project, it's been a boon. And then modern health surveys will allow us to take it through to the present, and I haven't got those results in this paper. So here's the kind of data we're looking at. An attestation form from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in World War I. And like a lot of bureaucratic forms, it's driven by the needs of what that organisation needed to do, and it changes a bit throughout the war. But they collect a range of socio-economic information, including where in the country the person was born, who they were working for. They have, trying to find where it is, and it sort of changes around. They have a question on education, which is a little coarse. They ask, did you complete Standard 4? 90-odd% of the people completed Standard 4, so it's not really giving us a lot of extra information about these people. Interestingly, in World War II, so here we have the sort of Waipara, North Canterbury, that's pretty precise. Lacking the provinces, lacking states or any sort of major subnational divisions, New Zealanders became pretty imprecise about where they were born later on. So in World War II, we almost totally lose the information on where in New Zealand they were born. I think in World War I they were collecting that information because they thought that it would fulfill the purpose of allowing the military to contact the parents if someone died. In World War II, they switched to asking, what's your parents' address and phone number? That's great for them, not so useful for us. On the back, they have medical and health information, the most usable of which is the height and weight. They also have chest expansion, and then a range of sort of indicator questions about people's health. The other thing which appears on the back here is their religious profession or identification. Often get a question about this. Why is the religious identification along there with the health information? Last rites, exactly. You're going to need to know these things probably around the same time, perhaps. So, yeah, morbidity and mortality is embedded in this form right from the start. 8.5 inches, 5 foot 8.5 inches. This is the kind of thing we like to see. If you see a lot of heaping on the whole inches, they're probably not taking it as seriously. It doesn't make a huge difference, but it indicates they're taking it seriously. The instructions we've seen about how they were to do this indicate that people would be measured without shoes. That's a good thing. And from what we've seen, at least in the Form Aid Centre's photographs, they had balance weight scales. We sort of push the little bars along and get the reading off of that. So not a lot of documentation survives about how they were collecting this. That's a little bit of a concern, but the sort of the internal evidence suggests they were fairly careful. There's not a lot of round numbers that appear in there. That's our sort of major test. So looking at how did people serving in the World Wars do, and this gives us sort of 20 years worth of data for each war in terms of birth cohorts. We don't see a trend towards rising stature for any of the cohorts that entered World War I. What we do see is some socioeconomic differences which are fairly large. They're about the same size, and this is in inches, so this is telling us that farm labourers, farmers, are about 3/4 of an inch taller than urban workers. The default category, the omitted category here, is urban workers, semi-skilled, so carpenters, drivers, that kind of occupation. And professional people also a little taller. Interestingly, Māori, slightly shorter, but the no indication of statistical significance at this point. And as we've expanded the World War I sample, this basic result that there's not a difference in Māori and Pākehā heights for the cohorts born before about 1895 is maintained. So this is not a sort of an artifact of sort of early stage of data collection. Moving on to World War II, very similar estimation of the model here. We just changed the birth cohorts. And again, no sort of apparent breakthrough to rising stature. So the interesting thing here is that New Zealand stature stagnated in the late 19th century and really didn't begin to recover. No sort of major turnaround in stature that we observe. The most significant thing, and this we found this sort of at an early stage of the research with World War II, is this emergence of a large and statistically significant gap in stature between Māori and Pākehā. So Māori, interestingly, never asked in the military whether you were Māori. We've just been able to identify this by name. Are now about 2/3 of an inch shorter, and that's strongly statistically significant. So the gap for Māori and Pākehā starts to emerge not in the late 19th century when population was declining, but in this era when population is recovering. So we were really intrigued by that finding, and this sort of really set us to going to prison and finding out, was this, do we see the same thing for Māori and Pākehā in prisons? And lo and behold, this is a sort of an alternative way of looking at things, the same basic result holds in terms of the timing of when that gap in Māori and Pākehā stature emerges. You can see it really diverging here around 1900, same sort of timing as the military records, and then beginning to close for the cohorts born after World War II. And our early results looking at the modern health and nutrition surveys, where we get cohorts that sort of go back into the 40s, 50s and 60s, 1940s, 50s and 60s, suggests that gap sort of continues to close after World War II during Māori urbanisation. So the gap in Māori and Pākehā stature is not in the immediate colonial period, it's in the period when Māori population's recovering, around the time of actually a lot of land loss and sort of after the Liberal era, but also the time of sort of an emergent welfare state for Pākehā. So there's sort of different, I think, explanations than we were expecting for why and when Māori and Pākehā health status, at least as measured through height, began to diverge. Another question which sort of has intrigued a lot of people is this difference in Māori and Pākehā BMI. Have Māori always been heavier? And the prison data suggests that yes, they have. Māori here in the red, as you can see, it sort of fluctuates a lot. This is for sort of entry into prison. This is the previous one is birth cohort. And you can see this gap of sort of about 2 to 3 BMI units pretty consistently. And this is controlling for occupation, so we've sort of eliminated occupational differences. It's a finding which is also robust to the prisons were much more concerned about, are you 3/4 Māori? Are you 1/64 Māori? That was the most extreme example we've seen. Mostly it's sort of half caste, maybe a quarter. But most of them are sort of marked as either Māori or not. There's no indication of iwi or sort of area of the country. So New Zealanders were relatively tall. I've sort of emphasised the negatives of some social differentiation between occupations and the emergence of this gap between Māori and Pākehā. But in international comparison, we were pretty much the second tallest in the world after the United States. And I think the most interesting finding, if you're going to go away remembering this part, is that the timing of the emergence of that gap between Māori and Pākehā in the early 20th century. And for Pākehā, the stagnation through to the 1940s. So Māori are sort of are falling behind. Pākehā are not really increasing their heights. So our linked sample, we stratify this by occupation and race. So to get enough Māori in this sample linked to their birth and death certificates, we selected all the Māori we had at the time that we drew the sample, and then divided it evenly between farmers and non-farmers. Our linkage results were, I think, fairly good for Pākehā. About 75% of the Pākehā were able to be linked to both their birth and their death certificates. The selection criteria here were that you had to have been born in New Zealand. We want to trace your whole life experience. So if you were born in England or Australia, you're potentially traceable, but much more expensive to do so. And also we can't parcel out when were you exposed to New Zealand conditions, so we concentrate on the New Zealand born. I think it's fairly well known that Māori were not brought into the civil registration system for births and deaths until around World War I, so we were not terribly surprised that we didn't find a lot of Māori. Some of them nevertheless were being registered, so we find about half the Māori that we look for. And some of the challenges here were actually changes of name. The births, deaths and marriages staff would do some basic variants on the spelling and look for that. Then they'd find more Māori that way. But if there's a major change of name, we're never going to find you. Name and date of birth is the main way we find people. Interestingly, about 5 to 10% of people lied about their age when they came into the military, literally rushing to get to war. And so what the births, deaths and marriages staff who did this linkage work for us said was that and they've indexed birth day, month and year separately, is that you just take out the year and lo and behold there's the person, they're just sort of 2 years younger than they said they were. If you're going to lie, try and lie about the least amount of stuff possible. So the group, despite the fewer Māori found than we would have hoped, I think that the resulting sample, there's not too much difference in the height, weight, and therefore BMI of these groups. It's fairly random. So this is, sorry, I've switched to centimetres here instead of inches. So this is the average height in centimetres, standard error, average weight in kilograms and standard error for the different groups. So the sort of the farm, non-farm, Māori and non-Māori. And then whether they weren't in the sample, so we didn't randomly select them to be linked, and then the difference here between were you successfully linked or did we fail to link you? And as you can see, the substantive differences in how tall people were, how heavy they were between those groups was not great. Mentioned that Māori in the prisons were significantly heavier in terms of their BMI. And that is the case. Again, this is a cross-section, so it's sort of in some ways less informative, even though I'm generally more comfortable talking about the military data. I think they did a better job of doing the measurements and everything. They had doctors doing it. I'm not sure that was the case in prison all the time. Māori, significantly heavier, 1 to 2 BMI units depending on the group. Than the equivalent group of Pākehā. So this is a gap in sort of stoutness, heaviness that goes back quite a way. Be interested to talk about that. And I think I've showed you that. So when these people returned from the war, we selected them also to have survived the war. We're not interested in the question which I've sometimes been asked is, if you were tall or short, were you more likely to get shot? That's an interesting question. It's not one which we're trying to address. We also selected that people did not die in the flu immediately after the war. Again, interesting question, not the one that we're interested in. Once these guys got back, they had a survival experience in terms of their life expectancy at age 21 or age 25, which was very similar to the overall cohort from which they came, which was broadly, on average, the birth cohort of 1891. Statistics New Zealand has published cohort life tables for the New Zealand population, so we're able to compare pretty precisely the survival experience of our group to the overall population. Some of whom, of course, a lot of whom, if they were male, did serve in the war. So it's a comparison which is sort of influenced by that. As you can see, survival experience of Māori is worse than for Pākehā, and it's a gap that emerges, pretty soon after they get back. So turning to sort of the interesting questions of if you're tall, do you die earlier? If you're short, do you die earlier? And then what about weight or BMI? So we find no effect of height on mortality. As I indicated, New Zealand's differences in height by socioeconomic status were about as large as in the United States. They're fairly small in other international contexts. I mentioned that in Britain, the gap between labourers and professional, the children of labourers and professionals, quite a lot larger. So finding that there's not a large effect or sort of a null effect of height on mortality perhaps indicates that New Zealand was fairly equal in terms of the height. People were reaching close to their height potential, and so people who were shorter because they didn't have the genes to be taller. So there's no sort of concern about finding a null effect for this. So the interesting results then are for weight, and we can look at this in several ways. I'm going to start out sort of with a graphical analysis of what's your relative risk of dying. Conditional on your BMI at enlistment. So the etiology here is a little stretched in some ways. We have your BMI at age 21 or a little older, about 21 to 30 for most of them. And then some of them die in the war and they fall out of our sample for that reason. Some of them die in the flu, we exclude them from the sample for that. Some of them die before age 40. There's not a lot of them that do that. What we're interested in sort of following the international literature on this question is early mortality. People who die before life expectancy. And in order to make some inferences about how does weight affect that, it's helpful to have a large enough number of people to be able to draw some distinctions between different categories of BMI, between people in broadly similar heaviness. So we sort of standardized to what was the mortality experience of people in the middle of the normal weight range, 21 to and the normal weight range is a BMI of 20 to 25. And what was the death rate in that group? And you can see here we've sort of standardized that to 1. And then we compare the death rates in other BMI categories, no larger than sort of 2 or 3 BMI units. We have about 15% of the sample who are overweight or obese, so there's a sizable number who were quite large, compared to the American studies of people in the who were born slightly earlier in the 19th century. We have about 3 times the number of overweight people in here. So we have enough power, I think, to sort of detect similar sized effects to the other historical studies of this question. But still fairly small numbers. This was a somewhat expensive project to do. But you can see that the pattern is that your risk of mortality, of early mortality, begins to rise a little after you're overweight, and keeps rising. It's not a result which is just for Pākehā or just for Māori. So I mentioned the Māori were heavier, but the same basic pattern of a rising risk of mortality if you're overweight as you get closer to obesity at a BMI of 30 or above holds for both Māori and Pākehā. And so once we get into the sort of obese category, and this is this group here, there are fewer Pākehā. And so it's estimated fairly imprecisely. Most of the obese people were Māori, which is in some ways unsurprising given that overall that population was a little heavier. So they're sort of shifted, they're basically all shifted to the right in their distribution of BMI for Māori. So this is a fairly simple way of looking at it, but a very similar sort of relative risk curve to what other people have found, and I'll return to that point in a moment. obviously one wants to sort out other things than weight. I've mentioned that we have their birth certificates, we have their death certificates. The birth certificate gives us their father's occupation. The death certificate gives us what they died of, where they were living, so we know something about their migration around New Zealand, so we're able to control for region of birth, the 4 main centres and rural areas. Obviously you can lose a whole lot of degrees of freedom if you have control for whether they were in Timaru or Whangarei. Ultimately that's not of interest, so we just go for the 4 big cities and then rural small city outside there. We know their occupation when they enlisted, and we know their ethnicity. So we know quite a lot of stuff about these people at various points in their life, which may also influence their mortality. And then in the paper we run through a series of Kaplan-Meier hazard models to sort of sort this out. If you don't know about Kaplan-Meier hazard models, I'll get to sort of explaining the most important part. And where are we? This is the most important result, that your chances of dying if you had a BMI of over 28 were about 43% greater than the people in the normal weight range of 20 to BMI of 20 to 22, which is the omitted category. So what we saw on the graph here, that your risk of mortality starts to rise once you're moderately overweight or a little above. That is confirmed once we control for everything. And this coefficient here with model 7, we did have models 1 through 6, not just starting at model 7. That's a coefficient which is pretty much unaffected by the addition of controls. So we think we're picking out an effect which is of BMI. Again, sort of remind you of the caveat that it's 30 years since these people were measured, and what is the causal connection there is something I think to discuss. But that's the same kind of thing that other people have done with people measured in the military or in other contexts early in their life. So the long period of follow-up is not uncommon in this literature. And then for Māori, obviously that you saw on the chart of the graph of their life expectancy after they returned, that they were starting to die a little earlier. We do, so this is sort of similar interpretation, about 18% more likely to die prematurely before age 70 if they've reached age 55. But the statistical significance at this point is marginal, and here we're really missing emotionally and genuinely the Māori we couldn't find. I think if we'd had more Māori, we would have been able to get greater degree of confidence in this result. I suppose interestingly, comparing coefficients, the coefficient on Māori is less than on BMI. So really only one significant result in these regressions, and that's the one on being overweight. How does that compare across countries and over time? So I mentioned that there's been 2 other historical studies of this question of how does BMI affect and height affect your mortality. And I've graphed those here in black. So here's the curve I just showed you. This is including all Māori and Pākehā. And then here are the 2 American studies, one of college students. So they were measured around the same age. They were measured at a very uniform age. A guy called Edward Hitchcock, who was sort of one of the pioneers of anthropometry, was the guy who measured these people, starting in the 1860s and going through the 1890s. They're followed up in the Amherst College record. Very well documented study. The US Union Army, large-scale study. I think precision of measurement probably not as good as in New Zealand in World War I. These guys are also measured around the same time of their life and then followed up across their lifespan. So the common thing is that we follow these people throughout their lives. And obviously we've all got fairly similar size samples, starting around a sample size of about 2 to 2,500 people. You lose people in the sort of longitudinal follow-up when their names change and when they move out of the country to Australia or Canada, or whatever place they choose to go. So ending up with about 1,500 to 1,800. And you can see the curves look fairly similar. You know, things bounce around because we've got fairly small numbers in these categories. So fairly similar sort of profile of how BMI affects your mortality in the 19th century. How does that compare to today? Huge amount of literature on this topic. And this publication by Flegel et al. Has gotten a lot of attention for whether they didn't control for confounding appropriately. A lot of attention to that. But they got a lot of headlines, and good on them, for saying that really your risk of mortality doesn't start to rise until you're really kind of obese. When you have a BMI of 30, it starts to rise, you can see it starts to rise here at sort of BMI of 30, 32 and over. And then they find an increasing effect as you get up to a BMI of 40, which is grossly obese. A more sort of a less controversial study is one by Calais et al. Done a few years ago. But even there you can see that the point at which your mortality risk starts to rise, conditional on your weight earlier in life, is further to the right. So you can get heavier before that starts to impact you. And then it rises less steeply. And this diverse populations meta-analysis is another well-regarded study. Again, the point at which mortality risk starts to rise, quite a lot further out than the 19th century studies, and then a less steep rise in the curve. So the sort of conclusion about how has this changed over time is that your chances of dying, conditional on being overweight at an early point in your life, have diminished significantly over the 20th century. That's something we'd sort of expect in a way with the great improvements in medical care, in drugs and other treatments for cardiovascular and circulatory conditions. But I think it's sort of brought into really stark relief here that very similar from different contexts, two different countries in the 19th century, and then these tell a slightly different story, but they're consistent in that the curve starts to rise at quite a different point than we're finding in the 19th century. What impact finally did that in New Zealand did being overweight have on your life expectancy? And to sort of get a handle on this, I have divided it up slightly differently. The substantive results don't really change if I sort of make that a BMI of less than 22, and then 22 to 25. I was trying to get approximately equal numbers, but also maintain the sort of normal weight, overweight distinction. And you can see again, this is the same sort of question: how heavy were you at enlistment? This is where the BMIs come from. And then if you've got to age 55, how many years after that do you live? And the gap starts to emerge very similar over your late 50s into your early 60s. And then the gap starts to emerge and become statistically significant in your mid to late 60s. And by the end by the time you're 70, statistically significant difference in the chance of surviving if you're overweight compared to the normal weight, the two categories of people in the normal weight range. Evaluated over the whole of their lifespan, again sort of maintaining these categories, the people who were overweight lived 2 years less. And again, statistically significant difference there. 2 years less than the people who were in the normal weight range. Is 2 years a lot? That's a sort of a judgment, a social judgment. It's certainly robust to the various ways we've looked at it. Depends how much you like your life, whether you want those extra 2 years, I guess. As a young scholar, I guess I might still be in the phase of life where I'm looking for similar results to what other people have found, and so we're sort of relieved to find similar studies to the US at the same time. I think, I was most interested in change over time. I think I would have been worried if I'd seen hey, in New Zealand being stout had quite a different effect than being stout in the US. I think that while there's room for sort of social, environmental, economic differences across countries, there is probably some kind of biological relationship here between being heavy and chances of early mortality. So seeing the same thing around the same time in broadly similar social and economic environments is good. It gives us a bit of confidence. But as I say, only 3 studies. So people should go and do this in Australia and England and Canada as well. We don't find a sort of a strong height-mortality relationship. I think that's, consistent with our evidence that New Zealand differentials in height were fairly small. Perhaps people were reaching their height potential, and perhaps New Zealand was fairly socially equal, like people said it was. And over time, we've seen, I think, a significant change in this BMI mortality relationship. I think that sort of pinpointing how that changed is an important question for further research. And actually, literally right after this meeting, I have a meeting with births, deaths and marriages who are pulling out the data for World War II soldiers. New Zealand soldiers in World War II are probably very comparable to New Zealand soldiers in World War I, save for being about 25 years difference in their birth cohorts. And so that will start to help us unravel, when did this change occur? The World War II cohorts born sort of 1910 through early 1920s are going to be hitting their 50s and the sort of critical period that we're interested in the 1970s. So medical care, particularly drugs, have advanced a lot in that 25 years. Do they have a better survival experience if they were a similar weight to their peers in World War I? That's the next question that I'm going to be going on with in this research, and look forward to in a couple of years maybe coming back and telling you about that.
Well, thank you very much. That's fascinating paper. Do we have any questions?
That was really, really interesting. Thank you. I presume the you that you're talking about is men, is it?
Yes, it is. Yes. So, yeah.
So there's another whole.
There's another whole question. Yeah.
Although of course there were nurses and who went. So bit of PC stuff there.
I would love to study the women. The New Zealand nurses, like their counterparts in other. In Canada and Australia, were pretty tall. They were very socioeconomically selected. Yeah. A lot of them. They're a much different population.
Actually, I had a serious question, which is
no, it's a good question.
Vogel wrote a book called Hunger, which I presume you've seen.
Yep.
And that raised the question for us where he looked at the Civil War experience, the medical records there, and then looked at the people who've been recorded as having typhoid or typhus. Typhoid or typhus.
Typhoid, yeah.
Yeah, I've forgotten which one. And then showed that those people actually lived much shorter lifespans than people who hadn't got infectious diseases, which raises really interesting issues between chronic disease.
Yep. And sort of acute.
Yeah. And do you know if you've got? You said you excluded the people who got influenza, which I know Nick Wilson's been really interested in. But have you got records of whether they got, for example, all the guys at Gallipoli who got dysentery and
the records about their service medical experience are pretty inconsistent. Some of the files will have their complete history record, with whether they got dysentery. Others will just be the attestation form, and so it's not clear to us why different, and it wasn't clear to the archives either, why some files have survived with a complete service record, why some files have survived with, the attestation has a lot of valuable information, but it does sort of restrict our ability to, do that question in the same way as Fogel et al., Fogel and Costa and others. Fogel just died the other day, by the way. He lived a very long life. So yeah, that's a little bit of a problem. I'll sort of mention another question that I've been asked about this. There's no record of smoking, and obviously that's a sort of a big thing which is going to affect people's mortality, which is addressed in these later studies in the 90s and onwards, but they're not asking that question. One almost assumes that they were all smoking.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in kind of social sciences there, I mean, in the department here, lots of people are really interested in that, because I think, Maori weren't protected in the Depression, which Ed Mara has written about a lot, and then you see Maori post-Second World War embraced in the welfare state for the first time, really, and I think you see then the determinants of health really kicking in.
Yeah, and on the World War II records, again, sort of a disappointment for us in the way that they were inconsistent about collecting records. They're asked about significant childhood diseases, but it's not really done in a very consistent way. So we're getting the research assistants to enter it, but I'm sceptical that we'll be able to do something consistently. And it's better than World War I, where the doctors basically are asked, like, does he have pockmarks? In World War II, they sort of asked themselves, like, what are the specific illnesses? But if they're not asked to go down a list of major illnesses, and when you have them, it's like, just remember them and list them on this free-form box.
So they wouldn't say whether they had rheumatic fever or something?
No. And I've seen records in other contexts where, in some US prisons, where they did actually do a sort of this list of about 15 different diseases, and that's a great way of doing it.
Great work.
Yeah, one can wish. That's the trouble with history. You can't go back and design your own data collection. But it's also an easy out for difficult questions.
By looking at the prison data, are you able to partial out whether going overseas as a soldier in either war had an effect?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
Whether service itself
service had an effect.
affected more life
expectancy. We haven't looked at the life expectancy of prisoners. So yeah, hard to answer that question. Money, no object. I think that would actually be quite an interesting thing to do as a sort of. So I'd like to do that, but it'll depend on funding. And the sort of the name change problem that I mentioned with Māori, I imagine that you might show up in a prison and the chance, they try to get the aliases. But I imagine the name change problem of tracing prisoners to their deaths is going to be significant.
Can you tell us what percentage or some idea of how many people were rejected on fiscal grounds so they wouldn't get into the suffrage?
So what that's a good question. About 15% of those who showed up were rejected. And then there were various exclusions from having to show up for a service, for being in an occupation that was valuable. We've got, I should mention, we do have their fitness indication in there. So their grading of sort of 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just a dummy variable, and it doesn't actually make a lot of difference in terms of the substantive results. So yeah, great question.
Thanks, that's really fascinating. And I know I've got a really couple of colleagues. I know Nick Wilson's very keen to be here because he's used the state source a lot himself.
Yeah.
And also get a PhD student. The Summers, who looked at experience, and this is really looking at the influenza outcomes.
Yeah, I got an email from her.
I think they're really fascinated to hear this. But of course, with Jennifer's PhD, the most unexpected finding was the relationship between chest circumference and mortality from influenza. And having a larger chest circumference was actually a significant, highly significant risk factor for dying from pandemic influenza. And so she doesn't, there are potential explanations for that. Yeah. But
so we should maybe add that in.
Well, I think if you've got that in your data set, it would be another really fascinating thing to look at.
Okay.
But I had another question really about this. It's great what you're doing. cause of death.
Yep.
That's presumably is coded.
It is coded, yeah. So one of the virtues of focusing on the older age group is that the suicides all happen before then. So if you look at it if you look at death before age 40, you're getting a lot more accidents and suicides in there. And I think out of a group of 2,000, there's about 20 suicides. And obviously, that might not be related to your height.
A comment which I find interesting as a biologist, and I know it's not your main line
Yeah.
of investigation, but this was the fact that the colonists coming here in the 19th century were living off the land, and they were farming plants and rearing animals that they brought with them, but they were still dependent on the local productivity of the land. And it was interesting that they seemed to be in, I won't say better, but they seemed to be larger.
Yes, the sort of earlier cohorts.
Which
yeah.
is exactly what you find in other animal populations when they expand into a new area, new
Yeah.
habitat. It's a suitable sort of habitat. I think the classic one is that possums are a kilogram heavier in New Zealand and they
Yeah.
get bitten twice a year.
Yes.
So the interesting thing here would have been to look at, if you were able to look at female fertility, because you would expect that to rise too.
Yeah. And the sort of the timing of the stagnation is very much consistent with rising export prices for milk, and Les Oxley's other work has sort of shown that while New Zealand per capita income rose, a lot of the gains from that export-led rise in income accrued to people who own land, and a lot of the population was moving to the city. The cities were huge, but that population wasn't getting the sort of the complete benefit of this rise in national income. Wages weren't rising as fast as national incomes or as farmers' earnings. So there's sort of some explanations for why it happens at that time, which one of the difficulties of this kind of research is that it points you to certain time periods that need more attention, but it's difficult to say, well, this is exactly why this happens. So it sort of opens up more questions.
I think in the early stage at this point where the colonists are escaping some of the things that were constraints from their home source. But as the population developed, other things became more complicated and typically human.
Okay, more questions? Okay, one last question from me.
Sure.
Actually, so I've got another question about the women.
Yeah.
Even if the nurses are a very kind of strongly
Small group.
selected group, can you not do change over time if you do and compare the World War I and World War II and compare the earlier? Do you have an earlier prison population of women?
We've collected all the women prisoners. The women nurses are sort of hard to find, and actually this was one of the difficulties with finding Māori, is that there's it was only recently that someone went back and sort of did a complete list of who's in the Māori battalion and sort of found all their service records. And so we're just about to get that complete, get all the Māori battalion records entered. But finding the Māori in World War I in the Pioneer Battalion is hard. This is a sort of roundabout way of saying the women are hard to find as well, because there's not a good index of who they were. It's sort of scattered across various issues of the New Zealand Gazette, just very laborious. I mean, there's 120,000 service records, so it's sort of time-consuming, and only about 600 of them. So we're really, we've got the prisoners, we've got the modern surveys. The women are a problem for us.
Okay, right.
Just a last quick thought. I mean, because Princess Tapuia didn't want the Tainui to go, you've got a natural experiment there
with the Waikato.
With the Waikato who didn't fight in World War I.
World War I, yeah.
Can you do anything with that? Has Tainui got really good ancestral records? At least the Mormon part of Tainui would have.
This is one of those times where I'm going to sort of kick it to my co-author. We're actually getting some of with the names, we are able, although it doesn't list iwi, obviously Māoris are able to sort of, identify names of different tribes, and we get a colleague of Lisa's at Waikato is helping us sort of say these are likely to be the iwi that particular people come from. So that's something we're working on, and hope to be able to say something about in the future.
Great work.
Thank you. Thank you.